Welcome, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you are watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
You're here. What's up, man? Doing all right? How are you?
Good. And this week is the start of our June Pride Month special, a special that we are calling Be Curious. Be Curious, Not Judgmental. I feel like I should know the name of my own series, but every week we're going to be looking at and talking with people in the LGBTQ community and some of the good work they're doing and some of the great organizations that they're a part of. And to start us off this week, we have Nicole Verdes. Verdes. I should know this. So Nicole's been living and working in San Diego since 2002. When she relocated from San Bernardino for work, she's a passionate community leader with 6 years of experience in nonprofit management and board governance, and more than 20 years of experience in the financial services industry. She's well-versed in client account management, budget, tax laws, reporting, conflict resolutions, and holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and a master's degree in sociological practice from Cal State San Marcos. She also enjoys volunteering in the queer community, most recently as the board president of Lambda Archives, the first non-binary person to hold this position. And at Lambda Archives, she's been successful in using her passion for social justice, arts, and culture, and cultural preservation to create policies that center equity and access to the arts. But more importantly than that, Nicole is one of my closest friends, and I've known Nicole since, I'm going to say, 1993. I don't know. Is that accurate?
Yeah, 93, 94. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we've kind of gone on and off, and in touch with one another, but she's always just been a good staple in my friend repertoire. And I am very, very happy that she's here to chat with us today. So welcome, Nicole.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So why don't we just start first by, talking about, the position you hold and kind of what is Lambda Archives? Like, what do they do?
Sure. So Lambda Archives of San Diego is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to collect, preserve, and share the local LGBTQ plus history of San Diego, Imperial Valley region, and Northern Baja California. We became a nonprofit officially in 1987, and many credit Jess Jessup as the founder of Lambda Archives. He was a nurse by trade. He was an activist who was very vocal about the lack of government support during the AIDS crisis, especially locally. He recognized that folks in our community at that time were dying off in record numbers because of AIDS and AIDS-related illnesses. So he actually started Lambda in his apartment as a way to collect and preserve the history of many who had passed away or were feared to, going to pass away at that time.
That's really cool. So why, I guess, what got you interested in working for them?
Technically, I'm a volunteer. I started volunteering for them in 2015, and I had written my master's thesis on an underground feminist punk rock movement called Riot Girl. And in my thesis, I did a content analysis of a lot of Riot Girl zines, and zines are self-published mini magazines that were used as a subversive method of communication for the punk rock movement. And that research is actually what initially made me aware of Lambda Archives and what was eventually, led me to be interested in volunteering with them. They had some zines in their collection and just archives in general. I just think they're amazing places. They're just treasure troves of history and information. So I'm still a volunteer for them all these years later.
That's super cool. I mean, it's amazing that there are organizations like that serve a really, really altruistic purpose. And, I would definitely encourage all of our listeners and watchers to look them up and see what kind of stuff they have. So being that this is the first of our 4-part series on LGBTQ plus types of issues, I wanted to know if maybe you can kind of level set for us. As Josh and I like to say, because of our political differences, because of just our racial differences, we've got a wide net of listeners, some that lean far left, right, middle, black, white, straight, what have you. So if someone out there is hearing me say LGBTQIA plus, what do all the letters mean?
Sure. So the letters stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, although sometimes the Q also stands for questioning, intersex, and asexual. And the plus generally signifies that there are many identities that make up the queer community, but many of those are often not included. So, for example, two-spirit refers to a person who identifies as having both a masculine and a feminine spirit, and it's used by some indigenous people to describe their sexual gender, their sexuality or gender, and or spiritual identity. Yeah.
Interesting.
Nice. When you say indigenous, what are you referring to? Like Native Americans? What are you referring to?
Native Americans, yes. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, it's always interesting because do you feel, this is an interesting question. Do you feel like they're going to add more letters?
Some people do. I have, obviously I'm pretty well connected in the queer community here in San Diego, and some people do. You'll see it very long with sometimes two-spirit included and that kind of thing. I would say generally the letters are LGBTQ plus, but you will see it expanded or you phrased it well, LGBTQIA plus. So I've seen it extremely long. I've seen it more short. Some people just say LGBT. So it depends.
Now, what about binary, non-binary? What does that mean?
So non-binary, put simply, is a term to describe people who identify with a gender outside of the gender binary. And the gender binary is, can be related to, or, basically male and female. That's the binary. So people that are non-binary definitely, or usually will identify outside of those constraints of male and female. And the gender binary is the assumption basically that all people are of one of two genders, female or male, or woman or man.
So what is gender? How do you understand gender if we have more than male and female? And of course, I'm the conservative evangelical host, so I'm supposed to be the guy who asks all these questions. Well, what's with these other genders? So, but what's a gender, and help me understand what a gender outside of our normal male female understanding. What would that look like?
It depends. I mean, it can look like a lot of different things. I don't think there's any set or rigid definition of what it is. For example, I can think back to when I was a child. I leaned sometimes more feminine, more masculine, sometimes neither, sometimes both. So I think that's the way to explain it, is that it's really just anything outside of the constraints, what we're all normally taught at a very young age, literally the minute we're born, that, you're either male or female, which is a socially constructed concept anyways, but it doesn't really look like anything in particular because it can be so different for different people.
Now, I've got this picture of you when you were a kid that I'll show. Just kidding. No, that was meant to kind of get you a little bit nervous, but I won't do that to you. Now, okay. So explain this to me. So, there is lesbian. There's lesbian, gay, and then you said there's queer, or it could be for questioning. When I grew up, I had only had a frame of reference for lesbian and gay, and even today, when I hear people call someone else queer, I somehow just feel like that's insulting. I don't know why, but there it just sounds like a bad word, kind of like the N word. So is it like, what's the proper term? Like, do you identify with queer or lesbian, or what's sort of the right label?
Well, I think the question of what is right is really specific to each individual. I do identify as queer and lesbian, but you could ask a million different people and get several different responses to that. And as far as using the word queer, it really depends on who you ask. I love the word queer because it's political. It places an emphasis on and a celebration of non-normative ways of being. So I think it goes beyond sexual identity too. I'm queer in the way I vote, the food I eat, and the clothes I wear. And I just think queer is so powerful of a word. And being queer doesn't restrict you from having other identities. Like I said, I also identify as lesbian. But having said all of that, I know many elders in the community who don't care for the word queer, and some are downright offended by it, most likely because of the original offensive meaning of the word as a slur. And as far as being restrictive to lesbians and gays, the term LGBT really became a part of the vernacular in the 1980s, and it kind of took the place of the word gay. Before LGBT, it was gay rights, gay activism, etc. And historically, there have been times when the T will intentionally be left off, which is problematic because it fails to recognize transgender folks as part of our community, which of course they are. But there are also other adaptations such as GLBT. Sometimes you'll see that, not very often, but you do see it from time to time. So it's complex, and I think, like I said, it really depends on who you ask.
Got it. So are there, like, to your knowledge, is there a faction of people that choose not to include or be inclusive of the QT plus community? Like, and is that an experience that you've had?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I see that. I don't see it as often now, which is a good thing. But there, like I said, a lot of elders are offended by the word queer, so they don't use it. They choose not to use it. And then a lot of folks, there's a term called a TERF, which stands for trans exclusionary radical feminist. That's an actual term used to describe, what would normally be painted as like a liberal leaning lesbian feminist, but one that's not inclusive of transgender folks. So it's definitely out there.
Like J.K. Rowling, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
That's amazing. Yeah. So one of the things I'm hearing is that you have these kind of maybe a little bit more clear cut categories of maybe like lesbian and gay, and then you have other categories that might be a little more complex, might be a little less, little more dynamic. It sounds like, and fluid than static, and I'm wondering, what do you think the core elements of the LGBTQIA community are that holds them together? Like, what characteristics, what is their core set of beliefs or core set of assumptions or set of characteristics that you could look for that is a unifying element? Or is it not like that? Is it more like we're unified against the larger culture that may not understand us, or we're unified in changing the larger culture, there's parts that don't get us? And because I guess where the question is coming from, so like if I say I'm a Christian, of course it's very complex, it's got a lot of things, but it also has some core characteristics that you say, hey, the people that believe in this, people that do that, they're considered Christian because they have these distinctions. What's the distinction in the community?
Yeah, I think going back to your point, it's more of a commonality of, the shared struggle and oppression of our community as a whole. I have seen a lot of debate between, for example, log cabin Republicans who are openly, LGBTQ plus, and more left-leaning or progressive folks. But I have also seen at times, not very often, but, where those groups come together because they understand that there's this common sense of oppression, and, it's recognized as a common social justice issue to work towards the equal, the pursuit of liberation for all of our community.
That's really good. So let's switch gears here for a second and talk about pronouns. So number one, what the heck is a pronoun? Two, why are they important?
Mm-hmm. So the simple answer to this is we all use pronouns, and we all always have. We all do. So there's nothing new about it. I think what's changed, though, is that there's more mindfulness in and around not assuming people's gender. For example, I know a lot of people that use they, them pronouns who are often misgendered because people assume their gender based on the way they dress or present themselves. And that means that folks that use they, them pronouns are constantly having to correct folks when they are misgendered. And it's exhausting. I've already heard both of you in this podcast use he as a pronoun, so we all use them. It's absolutely nothing new. And this also goes back to the gender binary and the assumption that many of us learned from the time we're born that, people are either male or female, and that simply isn't the case.
Interesting. So when, your pronouns are she/they. So, so the she part, for me, it's intuitive, but like the they part. So kind of explain how the they part apply to who you are.
Mm-hmm. So I don't feel, and like I said, I can trace this back to when I was a child. I can absolutely see parts of myself that reject a lot of standard notions of what femininity should be or how it should be expressed. And I've also had times in my life, even today at 44 years old, that, I lean more masculine or sometimes neither. But it would, the way I explain it, it would be like if somebody kept referring to you, Will, as she, and you had to keep going, well, I'm a he. That's an actual dialogue and conversation that happens all the time in the community. I see it happen at least weekly, so.
What's funny about that is that, I'm sorry to cut you off, is that number one, I probably wouldn't care. I'd just be like, fine, at least they're acknowledging my existence, and then two, this is probably going to be a really, really bad example, but I'm half Asian, right? So my mom's Vietnamese. My DNA test says I'm 80% Asian, 20% Black. So genetically, one would assume, genetically, I would be more accepted in the Asian community than I would in the Black community, but you only see the Black side of me, right? So most people just say, oh yeah, you're Black, then I always try to tell people, well, actually I'm Asian, and I'm wondering, is that kind of similar in the sense of if I could have a pronoun for my ethnicity or my racial makeup, that would be the thing that I would want to show people just so I can be identified correctly?
Yeah, I think it goes to self-identification. People should have the right to say, well, I'm, these are my pronouns and these are the pronouns I want you to use for me, without people saying, well, I don't do that. Or, sometimes I hear people say, I don't use pronouns. Everybody uses them, we all do. So, but yeah, you could look at it that way.
That's really, this is so interesting. What's your story, Nicole? How did you come to realize that you were non-binary?
I think that I have, to a certain degree, known it my entire life. I just didn't really have the language, or the words to be able to express it. So when I actually became more involved in the queer community and started seeing other people that were, outwardly identifying as non-binary and using they, them pronouns, all of a sudden there became, that language became available to me. So I started to be able to have the words and the language to be able to express what I've actually felt all along. So.
That's awesome. So my question here is about limits. And what I mean is, so are there limits to the degree to which we can identify ourselves? For instance, could I identify as Black? I've seen something like this. Like, here's where I'm getting at. Like, I've seen this. Like, I've seen like articles about this. People saying they identify as Black. It came out. I remember it was years ago now. That
Rachel Dolezal.
Yeah. So, I'm wondering, and you can speak to your specific views on this, or keep it more general if you want, and just what you've seen people believe. But what are the limits? Are there any limits to the things to which we can identify?
Yeah,
or is it set to gender? Do you think?
I mean, I do think the things are different. If you're not Black, then I don't think you should be identifying yourself that way, but I do think as far as gender is concerned, a lot of people make assumptions, like I said earlier, on the way that people present or things like that. So if somebody tells you that their pronouns are, they, them, or if they're non-binary, then that's, that is, their self-identification,
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we're recording this for Pride Month. It's in June. Can you explain what is Pride Month and why is there a whole month dedicated to Pride?
Sure. So Pride Month is generally the month of June. It's not that way everywhere. Here in San Diego, for example, it is in July. In Palm Springs, it's November. But usually that has to do with weather, by the way. In Palm Springs, it's too hot to have it during the month of June, so they have it in November. Yeah. But essentially, it is, the reason it's in June, generally speaking, is because it's commemoration of the anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And it's just an acknowledgement of, recognizing how the movement originally started, or the way that most people perceive that the movement really caught traction. It certainly didn't start with Stonewall, but that's the reason it's held in the month of June, and why there are celebrations, literally hundreds, I don't know how many across the world, that celebrate Pride Month as a way to really celebrate the movement, and, being prideful of who we are as queer folks.
Yeah. What is Stonewall?
So Stonewall was an uprising that occurred in 1969, June 28th, 1969, to be specific. The New York City police raided a gay bar on Christopher Street called the Stonewall Inn, which, by the way, is still there and was actually designated a historical monument by President Barack Obama. So raids like that at the time were actually not uncommon. They happened all the time. But the thing that separated this particular instance from previous ones is that the patrons and the community fought back against the raids. So there were violent clashes spread out across the community in New York over the following days. And a year later, in June of 1970, activists marked the first anniversary of the Stonewall riots with a march in Central Park. So that was really the first LGBT pride parade. And like I said, today there are hundreds of pride celebrations around the world. But the riots, had really a lasting impact in a greater way because they galvanized a growing movement and really defined it with a sense of purpose that, the community won't tolerate, that kind of behavior anymore from, police violence and that kind of thing.
So, yeah, we have Obergefell, which happened, of course, in 2015, Obergefell v. Hodges. And it was a major turning point in America. Can you talk about the history, kind of major events, maybe, of the history moving up to Obergefell and then even the significance of Obergefell?
Yeah, sure. So Obergefell versus Hodges was a landmark civil rights case where the Supreme Court ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. And essentially, James Obergefell had a partner that was dying, and he wanted to be married to him while he was still alive. And that's how this battle for same-sex marriage started, at least with him. There were obviously efforts that came before it. But this is the one that really stuck and really solidified the right to marry.
Okay, so have you ever met Obergefell?
Yes, we had an event at Lambda Archives with him where he did a speaking piece. He answered questions about his book, and really, really nice guy. And one thing that I remember him saying very clearly was that he wasn't really a natural activist. He described himself pre, the Supreme Court case as a checkbook activist. He's like, if some organization was worthwhile, he's like, I would write a check and forget about it. But, until it became deeply personal to me, and I had my partner that was literally dying, that's when it became this kind of behemoth of an issue for him personally. And then of course he became recognized, his name is linked to this Supreme Court case that is now tied to the fundamental right to marry.
Yeah. Is there any concern, or I guess what's the talk kind of in your community about, those particular rights being threatened?
Yeah, I think generally people are concerned, but ready to take on the battle and fight. And the truth is, these efforts are nothing new. Our rights are constantly under attack. It just doesn't always appear as evident as the threat to, Roe v. Wade or Obergefell and Hodges in the leaked Supreme Court document. There's a huge push right now for the Equality Act. And I think a lot of people don't realize, but LGBTQ plus folks still don't have full protection under the law. So the Equality Act is a bill in the United States Congress that, if passed, would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in employment, housing, public accommodations, education, a lot of different things. So that's where a lot of organizing efforts currently are in trying to get that passed. And as always, we're hopeful, and we know how to fight back. We know how to organize, and we're doing just that. So the fight really, really never ends.
Yeah, I can see how that would be the case. Where do you see the and again, knowing that you're not, to my knowledge, a legal scholar, but where do you see like the struggle with religious freedom and LGBTQ rights in terms of how people LGBTQIA, how people, like, if they're, how do you see those two, are those things in tension with each other? How is the religious freedom issue handled in the LGBTQIA community for you guys?
Yeah, I definitely sense a tension here in San Diego. We have an amazing community of faith leaders that are either LGBTQ plus themselves or LGBTQ plus affirming. So they're definitely, those folks are there and they are in the fight with us. But yeah, obviously religion, and I'm talking just very broadly, there's, extremism in any form can be very dangerous. And that's where I see the biggest problem is that like a Christian fundamentalist extremist mindset is, where you have folks saying that, queer, trans people are abominations, things like that. There's a constant, tension there. And that's where a lot of the opposing side, I think, comes from is, really extreme Christian fundamentalists.
Yeah, it's we've spoken to a lot of scholars, reporters about kind of the rise of Christian extremism. I think I think colloquially, like we just call them Christian nationalists. They're just like people that are way out there, people that, represent the same faith that I belong to. And are, in my opinion, are like the outcasts, but I'm sure that they're looking at me and be like, no, like I'm the outcast, because I'm a Democrat and I'm a Christian, so like I'm going to have a heck of a time getting into heaven when God checks my voter registration card,
Right.
So like, I'm curious, like, are there outcasts? And maybe this is a bad question to ask you. So answer as much as you want to answer, but like, is there a group within the LGBTQIA group that are kind of like the Christian nationalists of my faith?
Not in terms of identity. No, I can't think of anything like that.
Yeah. So I want to, if we can just go back to Stonewall for a second. And I want, if you can, create the timeline from Stonewall to Obergefell. I mean, in my mind, those two sort of events seem to be, two key pivotal moments within sort of the equal rights movement for the LGBTQ. So walk me through kind of like, life before Stonewall. Like, why did the cops have to raid this place, and then take us kind of to the present where we are today?
Sure. I mean, it is a hard question to answer, and not being a historian, I can't really, unless I had more time to kind of chart an actual timeline. But
Sure.
The raids were actually, like I said, they were not uncommon. And here in San Diego, a lot of community members that have been around a while have told me that, in the 60s or pre-Stonewall, the gay bars had to have, blacked out windows. And when the cops came in, they would scurry. They knew that if they were dancing with a partner of the same sex, that would be cause for arrest. And that technically the activities associated with being homosexual at the time, if you want to get technical, sodomy was illegal. The homosexuality was seen as a mental illness in the DSM, the psychological handbook that was referred to by, psychologists and that kind of thing. So it was seen really as a mental illness, even though obviously queer people, trans people have been around since the beginning of time. It's not new. But, activism has taken many forms. Pre-Stonewall, there was the Gay Liberation Front, which did a lot of really amazing boots on the ground activism work. Stonewall, a lot of people associate it with the movement as a whole, in the same way that I think a lot of people view the murder of George Floyd as, really the trigger point, or just the point that people just said enough is enough, that triggered this,
It's a watershed moment.
Yes, exactly. That's the way a lot of people see Stonewall. And then, going up to 1979, Dan White was, given a slap on the wrist for the assassinations of San Francisco Mayor George Mosquione and Harvey Milk, who was a member of the city's board of supervisors. He was one of the first, he wasn't the first, but one of the first openly gay politicians. And in the trial, even though it was clear that Dan White, went into the office and killed both of these men in plain sight in daylight, he used a defense that he had eaten too many Twinkies and his blood sugar was off because of the sugar. And, as a result, he really, he wasn't convicted of first degree murder, which is clearly what it was. And then that triggered the White Night riots, which were a series of violent events sparked by the announcement of his lenient sentencing. And that was also another one of those moments that, is recognized as a kind of a pivotal moment. But there are other things, during the Reagan administration, he would not, that entire administration would not address the AIDS crisis. They wouldn't speak about it. They wanted nothing to do with it. They just ignored it, and there's, it's, when you look back on it, you wonder what the response would have been if it would have been a disease that was impacting, white middle class men, you know what I mean, that were straight. Would the response have been different? And, I, as well as a lot of other people, believe that it would have been, but he was largely silent on that issue.
No, this is great. How much, then once I'm done answering this question, I'll give it over to Josh. But I remember in the 80s, there was a lot of bands, like Boy George and, what's another one? Anyways, there's other ones that escaping me, that they were public figures, musical, and Queen, yeah.
Freddie Mercury, for sure.
And it's just like they dressed very feminine, but it seemed like nobody really cared. Or at least I didn't care at the time. So do you think that had any bearing on sort of pushing sort of this normalization or helping sort of the movement for equality? Sort of the 80s, I don't know, rock scene, yacht rock scene.
That's interesting. I don't think so. My take on it has always been, I used to have a friend whose father was extremely homophobic. He was extremely homophobic, and he loved Boy George. He had gone to a couple of his concerts, and I think it's an interesting thing what people will accept when it's on TV or on stage or as part of entertainment, and what they will accept in their own homes or sitting next to you at the bar you go at, or, there's for some reason, a different kind of tolerance there. Not always, but, that's the way I see it. I just go back to that example of my friend's father, because he just was bananas over Boy George, which was shocking.
It's true. It's kind of like during the jazz era. It's like, we will come watch you play, but you still have to kind of go outside to use the restroom. Right.
Exactly. Exactly. Or, I also think it's just taken different forms. I remember seeing an interview with David Bowie, who, he got a lot of flack when he was a teenager for having long hair, and he was, constantly bullied and, called a girl and all this stuff. So I think it's always the same, but different,
Yeah, I do. It's really interesting. This is a fascinating conversation. It really is. Thanks for engaging in it with us. What do you think? What would you say are the biggest kind of issues that the LGBTQIA community is debating about? Meaning there's not agreement, there's not unity, there's not a wide sense of this is what should be the priorities. What would you say are the biggest, controversial issues that are debated right now within the community?
I would say one that comes to mind is that after the, the racial uprising of 2020, there was a movement with a lot of pride organizations that banned uniformed police officers from marching in pride parades. And that's something that people have been calling for decades. I mean, truthfully, that wasn't new. It was just that finally, you have one of those moments in history where things just shake loose. And some pride organizations decided to bar uniformed police officers from marching in the parade, from attending the festivals, things like that. And a lot of people were for it. But a lot of people were outraged. A lot of people that had been in the movement for a long time said, well, we worked for decades to get to a place where the cops weren't doing raids, and we tried to build, LGBTQ plus equity within the police department. And we did all these things. And now, this younger generation is coming along and saying they can't march in the parade anymore. And how dare you do that? But then you had other people saying, well, the entire pride movement really started with a response to state-sanctioned violence. So really, we're just going back to our roots. that's a huge thing right now. That's a big back and forth of people just being just angry about it, and then other people going, of course the police shouldn't be involved in this. It's not right. It's not who we are. So that, I would say that's one of the big ones right now.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really crazy. So like, is there, do you think it's a fair comparison to equate, marriage equality rights within the LGBTQ community to say like interracial marriage, and sort of the fight for equality there? Is that like, do you think those two sort of track on the similar paths, or are they different? And if so, like how? Because I'll give you just at least my 2 cents. First off is, because I think that there are similarities between the two. I mean, like my wife is white, and she's married to an Asian man who identifies as Black sometimes. And, we were able to get married with no problem. I mean, even though we got married in Indiana, there was no issues at all. But, my father, who was born in 1928, had he wanted to get married as a baby, couldn't, because, or I should say, if he wanted to get married to, another white toddler during that time, he would be able to. So, it seems like the duration, I don't know, like spans much further back for Blacks in America, when you think of sort of marriage equality. But on the same token, it's like there were like lesbian and gays going back equally as far, I'd imagine, right? So maybe if you can sort of give me, your 2 cents on how they're similar, how they're different.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core issue and the common denominator is oppression and control. It's unjust to say or have laws that say that two people belonging to two different racialized ethnicities are not able to marry. It's also unjust to say or have laws that say that two people of the same sex are not able to marry. So, and at the end of the day, really our liberation, all of us, it's intertwined. You can't express support for interracial marriage, but then turn around and say you don't believe in same-sex marriage. I mean, you could, but I think what some people don't understand is that the issues they're all related. They're linked. We can't pick and choose what social justice issues are worth fighting for, because they all are. So I think racial issues or LGBTQ plus issues and so on and so forth. Ultimately, the issues of oppression and control are rooted, like a lot of other issues in this country, I think, in white supremacy and extremist values that work to paint a certain type of person as good and pure and others as evil and deviant.
How do you define like extremist values? What would be some values that you think like are extremist? When you say that, what are you thinking?
I mean, I think it could be any number of things. When I say it, I think of people who, believe that the core of this country is rooted in, white being the overall, the goal, the thing to aspire to. Commonly disenfranchised shouldn't have the same rights as, what I would call like white Christian fundamentalists. So that, when some people talk about, well, I wish we could go back to, the 50s. Well, why? Because that's when, so many things were terrible. It's been a long road to get us where we are now, but I think a lot of times what folks mean when they say things like that is that they want to go back to where, they could use the N-word and, they could, not hire people because of their race and things like that. So when I talk about extremism, I talk about extremism in attitude. And certainly you could take it a step further and say that extremism could be, physically violent. But I also think that there are certain ideologies that by nature are also just violent.
So like the violence meaning like the ideology itself does violence, like in what way would you say? How does it do violence? As opposed to like someone doing physical violence for sure. I can see that, and I can see ideologies leading to physical violence.
Yeah.
And how do they? Is there a violence outside of physical violence that you would say that we need to regulate, or
Yeah, I don't know how you would regulate it, but I think also, and again, this is something you'll get different opinions depending on who you talk to, but I think that it's an act of violence to not use people's correct pronouns, and you'll find a lot of people feel the same. It's misgendering, or for example, when you call a transgender person by their dead name, which is the name they had before they changed it to a name that they chose for themselves as part of their process, that's also an act of violence. It's harmful. And it can grow to be, something more physically violent, but certainly ideologies and verbiage and words, they can absolutely do harm.
That's interesting. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think this kind of goes back to a conversation that you and I have had before, not necessarily on the record. So, but I remember asking, like, how do you approach somebody if you don't know, like, one, what gender, what pronoun, what they identify with, and because for me, it just seems awkward. Like, if I've never met you before and I came up to you and says, oh, hi, Nicole, what are your pronouns? Like that just seems like a weird way to start a conversation. So how is the best, or what is the best way to kind of approach someone? Because I tend to give people more benefit of the doubt. And like, I don't think that people intentionally want to, insult or, use our words to be hurtful or anything like that. We just went through 4 years of that, right? Heyo. Anyway, so, how would I approach somebody to make sure that I don't insult them?
Yeah. No, I don't think, and in your example, I don't think that you're intentionally causing harm. I don't think that's the issue at all. But, I think that what I hope we'll see, because I'm already seeing it here where I'm really active in the community, is that people do that. Hi, I'm Nicole. My pronouns are she, they. What's your name and what are your pronouns? That's a very common thing. I know it's probably seems difficult from the perspective of somebody that's not in the queer community as much, but I'm definitely seeing it more. You could also just refer to people by their names and not use pronouns. That's a way to address them without getting into, the possibility of misgendering them or anything like that. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, in that same vein, it's weird. And I say that with a grain of salt. Like, I've thought more about pronouns in the past couple weeks than I think I have in my entire life. Primarily because my circle of friends, I live in Virginia, so I don't necessarily have a whole lot of friends in the LGBTQ community. If I still lived in California, like near where you live, like, I wouldn't be an issue, so, and I work at home full time. So, like, the only people I interact with are my kids and my wife. How is it offensive if you use the wrong pronouns and like, how does that make people feel? And then what's the polite way for you to tell me, no, Will, like, I prefer they, them, you did call me her a couple times. How can I be a better steward of pronouns? Being that I don't think about them very often, in the sense of, if a deep South person moved to San Diego for a week and then they had somebody, introduce themselves as, hi, I'm Nicole. My pronouns are she, they, that deep South person, and I'm overly stereotyping here, but, would probably be caught off guard. So, like, what would you do, in that situation? Because it's almost like you'd have to kind of get them up to speed culturally in a short amount of time to really gaining a benefit from that interaction.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Well, the couple things is I think the harm comes in when people continually have to remind a person about their pronouns and the person's just not doing it. So there's a difference between maybe you meet somebody new, you get their pronouns wrong, they correct you, and then you get it right moving forward. That's different. But if it's somebody that's continually telling you that's not my correct pronouns, please use this, and the person's just not doing it, that is problematic. And I also, I have a friend who is originally from Wisconsin who is non-binary, and they tell me all the time that when they go home for the holidays, they have just kind of accepted the fact that they're going to get misgendered. It's simply because it's like this fatigue. They don't want to really deal with it. And probably a little bit because they don't feel entirely safe to deal with it. So that happens, and I've had those conversations with folks a lot where, I don't know if you've ever seen the memes, get in loser, we're going whatever, there's one that says, get in loser, we're going home for the holidays to get misgendered. So, that's definitely a thing. And it is hard too. You have to take into account that sometimes it might not be safe to have those conversations. I'm sitting here in my house in San Diego, and I've known Will for almost half my life, and I'm very comfortable having this conversation. But sometimes when my wife and I go to meet family in Riverside, there are times when I barely feel comfortable, walking close to her in public. And that's still,
Right.
A reality for a lot of folks is the feeling of safety. You really you might be an activist here in San Diego, but when you go elsewhere, you might curb, the way you handle certain situations or conversations based on just an issue with safety.
Yeah, no, I can see how that could be the case for sure. This is my last question. What is the end goal, would you say, of the movement, the LGBTQIA movement, if you want to call it that, community? What is the end goal? Is the end goal that everybody would respect pronouns, or that we didn't, use that we would all use those kind of pronouns? I mean, I know that this is, or that we'd all ask and introduce ourselves with those pronouns. I know that's just one example that would just say like an application of the goal. But what is the goal? As best as you can articulate it. What do you want from guys like me, pastor, white, straight, evangelical, voted for Trump 2016, didn't in 2020, but would vote Republican again, as long as, it's not someone I really don't like. But what's the end goal? What do you want from me? What do you want me to hear? How do you want me to change?
Yeah, I think that's
I think that's enough of a question.
It's a good question. I think the podcast is a good start. I think just the fact that you're having a platform like this it's important, and I think a lot of times people like me, I know that sounds funny, but people like me I work in a queer environment. I volunteer in the queer community. I say the word queer 50 times a day, it feels like sometimes. I'm constantly like everything in my world kind of revolves around that. But I think these kinds of dialogues sometimes are the most important in a way. How are you ever going to change anything if you don't engage with people?
You can't.
Maybe, or I love what Will said a little bit ago about I've never thought so much about pronouns as I have in the last couple of weeks. There's something important about that, and whether, what happens after, I don't know. But I think just the fact that these dialogues are happening in places that they don't typically, I think it's so important. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I don't know if you've experienced this, but during the George Floyd protest, in the Black Lives Matter movement, I had a lot of friends that I have never really spoken about race before reach out to me, to ask certain questions that I thought were actually really good questions. Someone someone wrote me, like, do you prefer Black or African American? And I'm like, I don't really care, like, call me Asian. And then that turns the conversation into a completely different way. But I think that, like, I think you're right. I think having sort of, these meaningful conversations in sort of a safe environment where it's like, sure, ask me questions. Ask me why you think calling me the N-word is not okay, but I can use it on another Black person. I think having those sort of dialogue is really, really great. And I'm super glad that you and I have known each other for so long. Because, like, I'll text you like, is this improper? Like, should I include pronouns or not? Because I just want to make sure.
So it's also really important to remember. Somebody said this to me, probably 10 years ago, and I never forgot it. And it was it had something to do with a conversation about race in a classroom, and I felt uncomfortable having that conversation, and I was afraid to engage in the conversation because I didn't want to make a mistake. And the person that I shared that with offline, outside of the classroom, basically said, "You're going to make mistakes. Like, mistakes will be made." But I don't think that that's a good enough reason to stop trying. I think it's important to engage, and especially when you're working with or talking with a community that you're not often around, you're probably going to make mistakes, but I think leaning into those mistakes is important, and it's not always comfortable, but it's crucial.
Yeah. So my last question is, do you think there'll ever be a day where, and this kind of ties into Josh's question a little bit, will ever be a day when, we learn about stuff like Stonewall in our general history class and not like our women's studies class, because I feel like, like in school, we learn about, certain equal rights, Brown v. Board of Education, stuff like that. And we don't have to learn about it in like an ethnic studies class, So, like, do you think there'll ever be a day where we learn about stuff that sort of moved equal rights, kind of in the right direction, specifically as it pertains to LGBTQ issues in the classroom?
I think so. I mean, there's already a movement to do just that. Here locally, there was recent little dust up at a school district where the school district is trying to implement a rule that LGBTQ plus youth cannot check out books from the library that have to do with gender affirming topics or LGBTQ plus topics unless they get permission from a parent, and that's been really problematic for activists in the queer community because sometimes as a kid, I wish I had access to those books. I just didn't know that they were around. But, when you're exploring parts of yourself, the last thing you want to do a lot of times as a teenager or preteen is go to your parents and start talking to them. The books are really helpful. They're, they can be a guide. And if students are already in a place where they're seeking out books like that, they already know a part of themselves to some degree. They already know. And kids know.
Mm-hmm.
I knew. Like I said earlier, I knew when I was so young, but I just didn't have the language to express it. And it took years, it took decades. I had to, go to a master's program to start learning about a lot of these issues for me to finally realize it was just, it took forever, and I wonder how differently things would have been if I had had access to things like that. So not to stray too far from what you were saying, but I do think there will be a time, and I think it goes back to, there's really never, the fight for whatever you want to call it, equality, justice, civil rights, it never ends. It just takes on different forms. And the fight always continues. So.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. And before you leave, I want to, I don't know, I just want to thank you for not only coming on our show, but for just being a good person and a good friend to me. What our audience doesn't know, and I think that Nicole doesn't necessarily wear her heart on her sleeve is like, I met Nicole like she said earlier, 1993, 94, something like that. We were on the same bus route in high school. and I remember, like, I think I even walked you home the first day or something like that. I mean, there wasn't anything like funny. It was just like, I don't know, you were new. I didn't have a lot of friends. I was a bit of a nerd in high school, and she was the cool gal. So I just thought maybe I'd get some street cred if I got to know the cool girl, and then we just became best buds, like forever and ever and ever. And then, the thing that I think I'm probably the most appreciative of, and you may have never heard me say this before, but it was when I came back home from Iraq. It was back in 2003, 2004. I came home to nobody. I mean, basically, all my friends were in Iraq. All my friends, kind of United States, has sort of dissipated and moved. But you were there for me, and I'll never forget that. And I just want to just let you know how appreciative I am. That you were a friend to me. When no one else was really around. So just thank you for that. You're an awesome person. You're an awesome guest. We appreciate what you do. And,
yes, thank you so much.
And yeah.
Well, I love you so much, and I was really stoked to be a part of this, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, cool. So good to meet you. And in 30 years when we're old and hopefully we're still alive, we should be. You might not be.
I probably won't. All right.
And hopefully you can say the same thing about me. All right.
Yeah, with that. All right. Thanks, everybody. And we will talk to you next week. Bye.